The full extent of Joe Biden's corruption exposed.
Mr. Reagan.
Since the whole Trump-Ukraine business began, even before impeachment, I was always a little puzzled. I mean, it was a perfectly ordinary phone call, and the Democrats were treating it like treason. It didn't make any sense. Well, I think I figured it out, but I'll get to that later. To understand this, we have to ask another question, a critical question, a question that the US media seems to be ignoring completely. Why did Burisma hire Hunter Biden? The entire case against Donald Trump relies on an assumption that Trump never suspected that Biden was guilty of anything. Democrats are assuming that when Trump asked the Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky about Burisma and the Bidens, that Trump knew with 100% certainty that Joe Biden is perfectly innocent of any kind of corruption in Ukraine. You will remember Adam Schiff's imaginary retelling of Trump's phone call where he asked the Ukrainian president to invent dirt on his political opponent.
I want you to make up dirt on my political opponent, understand, lots of it.
Now, this was, of course, to suggest that Trump didn't have any real suspicions about Biden, so he had to have somebody make some up. The Democrats are completely dismissing the possibility that Joe Biden might have done something wrong, or even that Trump might have thought that Joe Biden did something wrong. No, not possible. Joe Biden is an angel. But the truth is, what Joe Biden has already admitted to is incredibly suspicious. Joe Biden has admitted to withholding U.S. aid to Ukraine until the Ukrainians agreed to fire the federal prosecutor, Viktor Shokin.
So I got Ukraine, and I remember going over convincing our team, or others, to convincing us that we should be providing for loan guarantees. And I went over for, I guess, the 12th, 13th time to Kyiv, and I was supposed to announce that there was another $1 billion loan guarantee. And I had gotten a commitment from Poroshenko and from Yatsenyuk that they would take action against the state prosecutor, and they didn't. So they said they were walking out to press conference. I said, no, we're not going to give you the $1 billion. They said, you have no authority. You're not the president. The president said. I said, call him. I said, I'm telling you, you're not getting the $1 billion. I said, you're not getting the $1 billion. I'm going to be leaving here. And I think it was, 6 hours? I said, I'm leaving in 6 hours. If the prosecutor's not fired, you're not getting the money. Well, son of a bitch. Got fired.
Biden claims that he did this because the prosecutor was corrupt, but many others believe that he did this to protect his son, Hunter. Hunter, after all, was being paid very generously, $600,000 a year, maybe more, by a Ukrainian company at the time, Burisma. Burisma was paying him this money despite Hunter being totally unqualified for the board seat at an energy company. Biden had no energy, oil, or gas experience at all. And as we all know, Burisma was being investigated by the very prosecutor that Biden insisted be fired. It all sounds very suspicious. Biden withholds government aid to Ukraine until they fire a prosecutor who's investigating the company that his son sits on the board of, and we're supposed to believe that this is pure coincidence? It's pretty hard to swallow, but I guess if you're a Democrat, okay, you probably want to believe this. So of course the Democrats say they believe it, but it really does look like Joe Biden was compromising U.S. relations with Ukraine in order to protect his family. He used his political power to force the Ukrainians to bend the knee, to prostrate themselves before him and obey his commands. But according to Democrats, he did nothing wrong. Joe Biden is an angel. But apparently, if Donald Trump even asks about this, it's an impeachable offense. And it's that reaction, the impeachment of Trump over his looking into Burisma, that got me curious. Why is the Democrat beehive stirred up so furiously by this? Why have all the Democrats in D.C. lost their minds? So then I started thinking about Hunter and Burisma and Ukraine and Joe, and suddenly I had a staggering hypothesis materialize in my mind. Everybody has been working under the assumption that Burisma hired Hunter Biden for access to Joe Biden. Access. Now, why would Burisma need access to Joe Biden? Well, we'll get to that later, but they wouldn't. It turns out that hiring Hunter Biden in order to gain access and hopefully to influence Joe Biden would not have been particularly helpful to Burisma at the time he was hired. So the natural question then arises, Why did they hire an utterly unqualified son of the vice president? Peter Schweitzer hypothesizes in his book, Secret Empires, that Hunter Biden gave legitimacy to Burisma. Burisma is an utterly corrupt energy company, a business that might be better described as a criminal enterprise. And although Peter Schweitzer is kind of right, I mean, he is the son of the vice president, Hunter had been kicked out of the military for using cocaine just before he was hired on at Burisma, so he wouldn't have been that valuable. At least not for providing the business with legitimacy. Furthermore, paying somebody $600,000 a year to appear respectable might be a valuable investment for Shell or BP, but not like an essentially criminal enterprise. What this looks like to me is a cover. If you're paying off a public figure for a shady deal and you want to fake hire them in order to cover up your corruption, pretending that they were hired on to add legitimacy to your company is a great way to do that. And also, maybe it can help add legitimacy to your company, bonus. But with Burisma, there doesn't seem to be much, if any, benefit to appearing to be legitimate. No, I do not believe that this is why Hunter was hired. As I said, I recently developed my own hypothesis, but this hypothesis would rely on a few supporting facts if it were to be true. So to find out, I wrote a buddy of mine on Twitter, a buddy with a knack for digging up old documents. On Twitter, he goes by the name Dick Jackman, and I must thank him for helping me figure all this out. If you want to see a lot of dirt on AOC, Zach Exley, Joe Biden, and the entirety of the progressive wing of the Democrat Party, follow the man on Twitter. He's an astonishingly good source. My initial hypothesis was that maybe Joe Biden had some inside information as to what companies might benefit from U.S. aid to Ukraine, and so he tipped off his son, maybe steering him toward Burisma, a company he knew was about to benefit hugely from some foreign aid. But this is not what we found. What we uncovered was much, much worse than that. This is old school political corruption of the first order. Schiff tries to paint Trump as a mafia boss. Of course, that's nonsense. But this Biden situation, this is legit full-on mafia stuff. So it turns out not only was Biden somewhat involved with Ukraine in 2014 when Hunter was hired on at Burisma, Joe Biden was actually in charge of financial aid negotiations between the U.S. and Ukraine. He was in charge of negotiating the conditions of billions of dollars of U.S. aid to Ukraine in 2014, precisely the same time that Hunter got that job. Now, let me break down the timeline here so the full weight of Biden's corruption is made absolutely clear. In 2013, Joe Biden was negotiating the conditions upon which the U.S. would be willing to guarantee tens of billions of dollars in loan guarantees to Ukraine. Now, a lot of these loans were earmarked to help Ukraine develop their natural gas industry. Ukraine has a lot of natural gas reserves, but they import like 80% of their natural gas, which is a little bit weird. I mean, it has a lot to do with their relationship with Russia. The theory went that because Ukraine was dependent on natural gas, specifically natural gas from Russia, right, that Russia had all this influence on Ukraine. And it's true, it was a massive problem. Dependence on Russia kept corrupt politicians in office in Ukraine, and bribery and extortion and other forms of leverage kept the whole Ukrainian system stuck in a vicious web of corruption. So the idea was that if Ukraine could develop its own natural gas industry, Russia would have no leverage with Ukraine. But the truth is, I think something like 50% of the energy produced in Ukraine is nuclear, and I think 40% is coal. So honestly, I think it would have been cheaper if people just switched to electric stoves. But whatever, I mean, apparently natural gas is hugely important in Ukraine. Now, the money for Ukraine would go through the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, and Joe Biden was put in charge of negotiating the deal. He would present the president of Ukraine, Viktor Yanukovych, an offer for billions of dollars in aid in the form of loan guarantees, but Ukraine would have to submit to a variety of conditions. Yanukovych was sympathetic to Russia. He was hostile to Western Europe and to the United States. He declined the offer. According to the news agency Interfax, Yanukovych said specifically, "I had a conversation with U.S. President Joe Biden, who told me that the issue of the IMF loan had almost been resolved, but I told him that if the conditions remained, we would not need such loans." Soon after this, in February of 2014, there was a revolution in Ukraine. This was known as the Euromaidan protests, and Yanukovych was forcibly removed from office. On May 25th, 2014, another president was elected to office. Elected. Perhaps a more appropriate word would be installed. But either way, there was another man in office, Peter Poroshenko. On March 27, 2014, the IMF announced that it would issue a $14 to $18 billion rescue package for Ukraine. The deal negotiated between Joe Biden and Ukraine was done. And 1 month later, Burisma announced a new member of its board of directors, Joe Biden's son, Hunter Biden. Wow, that's not suspicious at all. Now remember, these loan guarantees were, in large part, intended to make Ukraine energy independent from Russia. Those who would benefit the most from this aid would be natural gas companies. Burisma. Joe Biden, of course, knew this. Suddenly, Burisma, a primary beneficiary of U.S. aid, is paying Hunter Biden $600,000 a year. Hunter Biden, the son of the man who negotiated that U.S. aid. Hunter Biden, a man utterly unqualified for the board seat he was offered. Now, it seems to me that one of two things happened in those negotiations that Joe Biden had with the government of Ukraine. The first possibility is that Joe Biden himself made the suggestion. There were some harsh conditions attached to the IMF aid to Ukraine. The Ukrainians wanted a better deal. Perhaps Joe Biden suggested that if one of the companies benefiting from this aid might present his son, Hunter, with a generous salary of, say, $600,000 a year, then perhaps some of those conditions might ease a little bit. I want to get my beak wet with this multi-billion-dollar relief money. Now, if this is true, then such a suggestion would have been a quid pro quo, a real quid pro quo. And we're all now very much aware of how terribly illegal a quid pro quo is. More likely, however, is that it was suggested by one of the Ukrainians. Remember, Ukrainians are accustomed to working within a corrupt system, using unethical tactics to negotiate deals. In this case, it seems likely that a common tactic might have been to tell a negotiating partner, well, listen, if you do us a favor here, we'll make sure your family is taken care of. Now, if this version of events is true, then what we're looking at is bribery. Joe Biden was bribed to modify the conditions of the IMF aid relief in order to benefit his family. It's as if a cop pulls you over and you mention that if he maybe forgets to write a ticket, a crisp $100 bill might find its way into his wallet, and the cop magically forgets to write you that ticket. That's called accepting a bribe, and that is a crime. Funny that the crimes here would be either quid pro quo or bribery, precisely what the Democrats are accusing Donald Trump of. Either way, this is embezzlement. Biden was essentially embezzling U.S. tax dollars into his son's pockets, maybe even into his own. I'd love to see if any of Hunter Biden's Burisma money found its way into Joe Biden's bank accounts. Joe Biden negotiated a deal in which U.S. tax dollars would be funneled to the IMF, then to Ukraine, then to Burisma, then to Hunter Biden, and then maybe even back to himself. If I'm right, Joe Biden found a way to embezzle U.S. tax dollars into his own pocket. And why would he think he could get away with it? Well, why does the secretary think that she can just write company checks to herself? Because working for a multi-million-dollar company, she thinks they won't miss a few thousand here or there. And that's what I suspect Joe Biden thought. It's $18 billion. Who's going to notice 600,000 here or there? Well, Kenneth Vogel, reporter for the New York Times, noticed. Thanks, Kenneth Vogel. Now, it's always been assumed that Burisma merely wanted access to Joe Biden, and that's why they hired Hunter. I mentioned this earlier in the video, but now I think it's time that we looked into the details of why this makes no sense. As we know, Joe Biden was already the chief negotiator between the U.S. and Ukraine, and the money was already going to be directed toward natural gas companies. So the next obvious question is, which natural gas company? The truth is, Burisma would almost certainly have gotten a big piece of the pie, if not all of it, with or without hiring Hunter Biden. You see, Burisma is owned by this man, Mykola Zlochevsky. Besides owning Burisma, Zlochevsky is a corrupt Ukrainian politician. Zlochevsky was, at the time, woven into the fabric of the Ukrainian federal government. Burisma was the inevitable beneficiary of a lot of Joe Biden's aid money. So it was in Zlochevsky's interest to get the best deal possible for Ukraine. In fact, it was probably Zlochevsky's idea originally to bribe Joe Biden. But maybe not, because it might have also been the idea of another corrupt Ukrainian, a far more dangerous one. This man, Igor Kolomoisky. Igor Kolomoisky is the third richest man in Ukraine, probably the second richest actually, because as you'll see, he's got a couple of bucks stashed away under the mattress. Igor Kolomoisky is one of the most feared man in Ukraine. He's a known murderer, thief, and con man. In December 2016, his bank, called Privatbank, was seized by the Ukrainian government because basically it was stealing money from its customers. The decision for the seizure was made by this woman, Valeria Gontaryova. Why is she in a wheelchair? Because as revenge for seizing his bank, Igor Kolomoisky had one of his henchmen run her over in a car. He then had her house burned to the ground. Yeah. This guy is a full-on Bond villain. In his office in Ukraine, he has, no joke, a giant aquarium filled with sharks. And he has a remote control on his desk, all right, where he can push a button and it'll drop crawdad meat into the shark tank, right? And the sharks will go and attack it. I mentioned the name Igor Kolomoisky to my girlfriend. She goes, "Oh, yes, I know all about Igor Kolomoisky. Looks like Santa Claus." I'm like, yeah, he's evil Santa Claus. He is the Bond villain, evil Santa Claus. That's what he is. It's mental. Okay, my God. All right, it just gets crazier. Igor Kolomoisky gained his fortune by hiring mercenaries to take over businesses at gunpoint. This is called raiding in Ukraine, and apparently it's relatively common. I asked my girlfriend about it. She goes, "Oh, yeah. Raid. It's the same word in Russian." So when you hear that Ukraine is a corrupt country, maybe this will give you some idea of what exactly that means. Kolomoisky is by far the most successful raider oligarch, and as it turns out, Zlochevsky's company Burisma is actually under the control of Igor Kolomoisky. So when Joe Biden got Hunter his job, he wasn't just negotiating with the Ukrainian officials and the owner of Burisma, Mykola Zlochevsky, but also this lunatic, Igor Kolomoisky. But the original owner, Zlochevsky, is still in name the head of Burisma. So if Burisma were ever to be investigated for illegal activity, for instance, it would be Zlochevsky that would be on the hook in Ukraine. So when Joe Biden forced the Ukrainian government to fire the Prosecutor General, Viktor Shokin, and effectively stop the investigation into Burisma, it was Mykola Zlochevsky that Biden ended up protecting. But if I'm right about this, protecting Mykola Zlochevsky was merely an unintended consequence of Biden's infamous little quid pro quo. You see, if Viktor Shokin had proceeded with his investigation into Burisma, he would have eventually uncovered the deal that was struck with Joe Biden to funnel money to his son. Joe Biden would have been ruined, his career over, probably prosecuted here in the US, maybe even imprisoned. So as far as Joe Biden was concerned, Viktor Shokin had to go. Throughout this impeachment circus, we've been under the assumption that Biden was trying to protect his son from Shokin. No, Biden was protecting himself. In May of this year, there was yet another presidential election in Ukraine, and a shockingly unexpected winner emerged, a famous TV comedian. Vladimir Zelensky won the election and took over the government, promising to finally rid the country of corruption. In the wake of this election, Mykola Zlochevsky, the owner of Burisma, disappeared. The former oligarch and head of Burisma is suspected by Ukrainian police of, quote, theft of government funds on an especially large scale. But the truth is, Zlochevsky is probably just the fall guy. The man who's actually guilty of, quote, theft of government funds on an especially large scale is almost certainly Igor Kolomoisky. And this man, Kolomoisky, remember, is the man who hired Hunter Biden. Unlike Zlochevsky, Igor Kolomoisky has not gone into hiding. In fact, it's speculated that since the election of Vladimir Zelensky, Kolomoisky has become the de facto dictator of Ukraine. You know how I said that before Vladimir Zelensky became president, he was this famous Ukrainian comedian? Well, the television network upon which Vladimir Zelensky performed, this television network was owned by, that's right, the Bond villain himself, evil Santa Claus, Igor Kolomoisky. Some believe that it was Kolomoisky's plan all along to get Vladimir Zelensky elected as a puppet president and control the country through him. Now, I don't know if that's true, but it seems plausible. I'd like to think that Zelensky is his own man, incorruptible, and he will eventually clean up Ukraine, but I fear that if Kolomoisky didn't control Zelensky from the start, he more than likely controls him now. The truth is, we probably shouldn't be giving relief aid to Ukraine at all. It's probably just going to be stolen by the corrupt oligarchs like Kolomoisky again and again and again. Speaking of, I forgot to mention something. Of the billions in relief aid that have gone to Ukraine because of Joe Biden's negotiations, at least $1.8 billion was stolen by Kolomoisky, right out of his own bank. The money was traced by a Ukrainian watchdog group known as Nashi Groshi. The money, as I said, was being kept at Kolomoisky's bank, Privatbank. And after being shuffled around in various offshore accounts, and then through the creative use of some fake orders for goods, the money somehow disappeared. That's U.S. tax dollars, remember, and Joe Biden facilitated that theft. I mean, look, maybe the Bidens are totally innocent. Maybe Joe Biden was just so stupid that he accidentally facilitated the theft of $1.8 billion in U.S. taxpayer dollars to a criminal Ukrainian oligarch. And maybe Hunter Biden just happened to end up working for that same Ukrainian oligarch, making a reported $600,000 a year, but probably more. But no. Joe Biden sometimes seems like an idiot, but this was no accident. Joe Biden leveraged U.S. aid to Ukraine in order to funnel U.S. tax dollars into his own pockets. And he has facilitated the theft of billions more U.S. taxpayer dollars. I don't have a smoking gun. I can't prove this, but it seems pretty obvious. Joe Biden then had Viktor Shokin fired in order to cover up his crimes, compounding the incidents of corruption. And who knows, this could all just be the tip of the iceberg. We also know about dirty dealings in China, and we know that Biden was infamous for his wasteful spending of taxpayer money as vice president. And who knows how many more skeletons there are gathering dust in Joe Biden's closets. When Kenneth Vogel and Peter Schweitzer first uncovered these things, and Trump looked into it, this caused a problem. There was now a real risk that Biden's misdeeds were about to all be exposed. And this, ladies and gentlemen, is why the Democrat Party has turned into a pack of ravenous monsters. This impeachment isn't about Donald Trump. It's not about winning the 2020 election. It's about protecting Joe Biden. In magic, there's a principle called misdirection. While a magician sets up a trick with one hand, he misdirects your attention with the other. Impeachment is one massive exercise in misdirection. It's an all-hands-on-deck effort by Democrats to direct America's eyes away from Joe Biden's crimes. Nothing to see here, folks. Here, you know what? Look here instead. So the next natural question becomes, why do the Democrats care so much about Joe Biden? I mean, if Biden's guilty of this, why are the Democrats protecting him? They have other candidates. They're not great options, but neither is Joe. So why are the Democrats in D.C. protecting him so ravenously? It's because Joe Biden was Barack Obama's vice president, and Barack Obama is the left's golden cow. Democrats worship at the feet of Obama. They have canonized the man. His legacy is now the stuff of legend in the Democrat Party. He was the first black president. He was a leftist, and he was cool. He was a Democrat that all other Democrats can look up to as an example of what a Democrat should be. He was untarnished by personal scandal like Bill Clinton. Obama is to Democrats what Reagan is to Republicans. But if all this Biden stuff were to be exposed, it could destroy Obama's legacy. America would abandon the Democrat Party. We'd have Republican presidents for the next 50 years. The Democrats in Washington, D.C. will do anything to salvage the reputation of their party. They will risk total loss of personal integrity to salvage the integrity of the party, because Pelosi and Schiff and Nadler and Schumer, they all know that if the party dies, their power dies with it. They will not just stand idly by and watch the Democrat Party be obliterated. They will do anything to protect it. Now you might be saying, well, this sounds a bit extreme. Couldn't they just claim that Obama didn't know? And they could do that. But this is too big of a scandal. It would still leave an indelible stain on the administration. If Obama's vice president accepted a bribe from a foreign government, embezzled U.S. taxpayer money, and facilitated the theft of $1.8 U.S. taxpayer dollars, the American public would lose all faith in the Democrat Party. And there's one more thing that I haven't told you about Biden's dealings with Ukraine. November 16th, 2017, Joe Biden's organization, the Penn Biden Center for Diplomacy and Global Engagement, posted this tweet. It's hard for a president to give absolute authority to a vice president. It takes a great deal of confidence for a president to say, you do Iraq, you do Ukraine, Joe. This was a direct quote from Joe Biden himself. Obama gave Biden absolute authority over U.S. foreign dealings with Ukraine. Absolute authority. That's unprecedented. A vice president having absolute authority over U.S. dealings with a foreign nation? Why would Obama do that? You've got to remember, Obama came up in politics in Chicago. Chicago is notoriously the most corrupt city in America. In order to rise up in Chicago, Obama would have had to turn a blind eye to many a corrupt dealing. Obama was used to it. In D.C., it wouldn't have been any different. It makes sense that if Obama knew what Biden was doing, that he would want to divorce himself from Ukraine completely. He would want zero accountability. I believe that Obama wanted to eliminate the possibility that Biden's corruption could be traced back to him. Plausible deniability. And this is why I suspect that Obama gave Ukraine absolute authority. Here, if you want to be corrupt, it's all on you. You own this now. You do Ukraine. Obama knew. Before I go, I need to say that everything I've speculated here was built on the reporting of Kenneth Vogel of the New York Times and Peter Schweitzer, who wrote this book right here, Secret Empires. If you don't have it, get it. The value of Vogel and Schweitzer's reporting cannot be overstated. Well, that's it for me. Good night. I hope I don't get kicked off the YouTube for this. If I get kicked off of YouTube, then you know this is all true. I think they would only kick me off if they get a phone call from Joe Biden or something like that. Well, hopefully this goes viral.
Those who would trade our freedom for the soup kitchen of the welfare state have told us they have a utopian solution of peace without victory. They call their policy accommodation. This is the issue of this election. Whether we believe in our capacity for self-government or whether we abandon the American Revolution and confess that a little intellectual elite in a far distant capital can plan our lives for us better than we can plan them ourselves.